Not a sailor, however, this was at sea. My dad went boating with some friends down near Rocky Point in Mexico in the mid-90s. They went out late at night to drink. It was incredibly dark apart from the boat lights when suddenly a helicopter flew above their boat, and the local who took them out shut everything off immediately. The helicopter hovered over some water in the distance, and dumped a few bodies into the water before flying off. When it was out of sight, the local turned everything back on and shrugged it off, saying, "They do that all the time, never seen it so close up before." In the Gulf of Alaska, I have seen some shit. But one of the most terror-inspiring things I've seen are what can happen with some of the loose logs from the logging trade. Sometimes when a big log gets loose from a raft, it becomes partially waterlogged and floats small end up. So you have this 4-foot diameter telephone pole in the sea, sticking up 40 feet into the air. No biggie, it shows up on radar, and easy to spot. Now, give that pole 20 years of floating around or so. It rots in such a way that it becomes fouled to a point by wind and waves, and looks quite menacing. Now, put it in a gale with 25-foot waves, 50 feet trough to peak, and it becomes a towering spike of death that shoots up from the sea every 15 to 20 minutes, out of nowhere, 60 feet into the air, only to plunge down into the dark depths waiting to skewer some unsuspecting boat in a few minutes when it thrusts out of the ocean again. It is a genuine terrifying sight, rare, but not so rare that I haven't seen two in one season. It's like the spiked dick of Neptune looking for an opportunity to fuck your shit up in a particularly terrifying way. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of oceans nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight, at the break of dawn, and there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. Not me but my dad. He was in the U.S. Coast Guard and often was at sea when I was little. He told me about the makeshift rafts Cubans would use to try to get to Florida. A 103-mile journey at the closest ponnets. The one that messed him up the most was a raft about 7 by 5 foot setting out with 6 people. 2 adult females, a 14 to 16 years old boy, a 9 to 10 years old girl, a 3 to 4-year-old boy and baby no older than a year in one of the women's arms. All of them with rope wrap around their waist connectioning them to the raft. They were out there for at least a week when my dad's ship found them all, but the 3 to 4-year-old had died. They had rescued him and retrieved the bodies, having to send them all back to Cuba. I cannot imagine how terrible and desperate their situation in Cuba was to decide that going to sea was the best option. This was in 2003. I crewed on a tall ship and we were anchored with a bunch of others in a harbor. We had to take shifts at night because it was an old boat and did weird things. I was on shift in the little steering cabin when I heard someone running around the deck. I thought it was one of the other crews, so I poked my head out and told them to knock it off. They kept running and I was afraid they'd slip, so I followed them. We went around the whole ship twice before I caught up with a shapeless shadow which stopped and flew directly up into the air. Convinced it was a prank, I walked back to the end of the boat when I saw we had drifted on anchor and were almost under the bow of a much larger ship. I called the rest of the crew and we sorted it out. But I might not have noticed until too late if it weren't for the weird shadow. We were heading off at night during the winter gales, and about 5 hours offshore around midnight I finished my shift and headed off to a crafty little platform at the stern where I could toke my nightly reefer in peace, and I saw the massive bright ship's spotlights scanning slowly and methodically back and forth across the waves. I guessed this was for a jumper and sitting there slightly baked, and I could imagine perhaps glimpsing a last sight of some poor doomed soul struggling in the chop, before disappearing off into the vast black expanse of the Atlantic. An office later confirmed the spotlights that night were for someone who had apparently jumped off a ship that had passed in the opposite direction.